So the plan of action today, I'll put in a timer just so I don't overrun. I'll try not to overrun an hour anyway is the plan. So we'll see how we get on. So the idea of today is talking about a Searching for Scabious project. So as you guessed, my name is Liam Olds. I'm Conservation Officer for the charity Buglife Cymru. And we have a new project which has recently started called Searching for Scabious, which is all about looking for scabious associated solitary bees. So today I'm just going to kind of talk to you about some of our target species that we're looking for, and hopefully train you all up so that you know kind of what you're looking for, and you can just kind of keep an eye out for these bees when you're out doing your daily exercise or your own land with scabious or whatever. So that's the idea anyway. So start making a move. So the project runs from the 1st of July of this year to the 30th of November. So it's literally only a few months long. So it's a very short-lived project. Of course, with COVID, we would have hoped to have delivered a lot of these sort of workshops in person, which would be a little bit better. But I suppose one of the pros of COVID is the fact that we can do things on Zoom now, or we're forced to do things on Zoom, and we can reach people further afield. So we've got people all over Wales now, as well as outside of Wales. So it allows us to get a bit further. And the project really is just aims to raise awareness of some of Wales's most threatened solitary bees, which are the ones associated with scabious, and increase knowledge of the distribution and conservation as well. And I should say that it's funded by the People's Postcode Lottery as well. So very much thanks to the funders for that. And it has several outputs, and the outputs of the project really are to survey both known sites for our target species as well as historic sites, so where they were previously recorded but haven't been seen for large periods of time. That's obviously to hope to find new populations. But we're also looking at sites that support suitable habitat as well. So as with most bees and generally invertebrates in the UK, they're generally under-recorded. So there could well be other populations hiding away that we don't know of at the moment. And really, by going out surveying these sites, we should get up-to-date records then, and an idea of the distribution in Wales, and it's going to inform management on the ground then. So it sort of helps us conserve these species as well. So it's a valuable thing to do. We're also recording and mapping areas of scabious on sites, which is easier when you've got sort of devil's bit scabious carpets, and you can kind of map that quite easily. A bit more difficult on some sites. So this is just to get an idea of where species are, or where these species are using scabious on sites, so we can inform landowners. And then is the provision of landowner advice. So giving the landowners advice on how to better manage their sites for those species, and also looking at sort of the restoration of sites that have become degraded, or we're looking to enhance those sites by things like plug planting. So they're hopefully benefiting those species where we do find them, and also delivering training sessions, which is obviously one of the ones we're on today, really. So we get more people trained up or aware of these bees, and then able to record them, and ultimately improve our knowledge of them. So we have four main target species for the project. So these are the Large Scabious Mining Bee, which is in the top left. We got the Small Scabious Mining Bee, which is in the top right. And then we got two of the cuckoo bees. So cuckoo bees sneak into the nests of other bees and lay their eggs. So these are the armed Nomad bee, which is in the bottom left, and then the silver-sided Nomad bee, which is in the bottom right. So most solitary bees have their own kind of associated cuckoo bee as well. So these will only usually target that particular species or related species. So as you've guessed, the large and the small scabious mining bee are associated with scabious, and then their cuckoos are obviously reliant on those scabious habitats because they use those mining bees as their hosts. And as you probably guessed, why are we sort of looking at these bees? And the reason is just because these species have declined quite substantially over much of their former range. So they were previously perhaps more widespread, and with the loss of scabious-rich habitats, that might be due to coastal development where you had scabious-rich grassland on coastal cliffs and so forth, or particularly agricultural intensification, so the loss of scabious-rich and improved grasslands, so the improvement of grasslands with the use of fertilizer and other things that resulted in the loss of those grasslands. So when you lose that scabious, you of course lose the associated bees as well then. So of course I kind of just got to run through just the general basics of what is a bee, and then kind of introduce you to the groups, the mining bees and the nomad bees, and then we'll touch on the actual species that I wanted to look for. So a bee, of course, is an insect. So it has a three-part body. So it has a head, a thorax, and an abdomen, or a top, middle, and bottom. And then it has 3 pairs of legs as well. And they belong to an order called the Hymenoptera, which just means that they have 2 pairs of membranous wings and an ovipositor or egg-laying tube that's been specialized for stinging. So flies would have just a single pair of wings, whereas bees and wasps have 2 pairs, so 4 wings in total. And they belong to a superfamily called the Apoidea, which are the bees. And interestingly, bees are actually wasps. They're highly evolved wasps in the family Crabonidae. So they're essentially wasps that used to hunt thrips, which are little teeny little things that I often see them in flowers. But essentially this group of wasps that hunt them decided to start eating pollen instead. And that's what gave us the bees. So they actually exist within the wasps themselves. And the bees evolved around 125 million years ago, so they've been around a long time and well before the last mass extinction of the dinosaurs around 66 million years ago. So they've been here a long time and very successful group. And the oldest known fossils are 100 million years old of nests. So they found all the fossilized underground nests of, I think they were mason bees of some description. And worldwide, there are over 20,000 bees that are known so far. So this is 5 times more than there are mammals and 3 times more than there are birds in the world. So there's plenty of bees out there in the world, and even in the UK, we do fairly well as well. So at the UK level, we got around 255 species of bee. The official list is about 275, but that excludes or it includes a lot of the species that are believed to have gone extinct. So I've sort of them out, and I think the true figure is around 255 species that we know are still found in the UK. And most of these are solitary bees, but we have 24 species of bumblebee, the 1 honeybee species, so it's just the 1 honeybee species across the whole of Europe, and then over 230 then solitary bees. So bees are, interestingly, they're pollen eaters as well as pollinators. So of course they collect pollen on their body and transfer it around and do pollination. But the reason they're collecting the pollen is that they need to consume the pollen. So they're actually eating the pollen, you could say. But the plants are they've got this close relationship that they sacrifice some pollen, but we know that it's going to be used, some of it, to pollinate other plants. So all bees get visit plants for the nectar, which is used as a sugar source, as a source of fuel. And then they also collect the pollen as well, which is the protein-rich food that the larvae need to develop, and the females, the adult females, also need for egg production as well. So when it comes to bee identification, particularly when trying to identify some of the mining bees, particularly things like some of the solitary bees like mining bees, you'll see a lot of honeybees when you're out and about, and when you're starting out it can be a little bit confusing. What you think might be a solitary bee is usually a honeybee. So just kind of running through just the key characters of honeybees, because you'll see these quite a bit, especially if you're in more urban areas. So there's 2 or 3 sort of main characteristics really of a honeybee. The first thing is the hairy eyes. So hopefully you can just see with that fringe of long hairs around the edge of the eye there. So that's quite distinctive. There's not many solitary bees that have hairy eyes. I think there's two genera, which are the sharp-tailed bees and the wool-carded bees, which look totally different. So if you see hairy eyes, then that's a good character. And these come out quite well on photos, especially from a top-down sort of view of the insect. And then the other thing to look at is the hind legs. So you're looking at the hind tibia, which would be kind of the equivalent of our thighs. And it's got a flat, shiny area with long hairs around, and that's the pollen basket. So that's where the honeybee sticks its the pollen. So I'm sure many of you have seen honeybees flying around with massive yellow sort of balls stuck to the legs, and that's where it's stuck into the pollen basket. And then they also have this swollen bassi tarsus, which is the basal segment of the tarsi or the feet. And that's also very much like the pollen basket. So it's like a continuation of the pollen basket. And that'll also be storing pollen as well. So that's what you need to do really, is look at the eyes and look at the hind legs. And if you see anything with large balls of pollen stuck on his leg, you're pretty much looking at a honeybee or a bumblebee, which also have pollen baskets. And here is a close look at that pollen basket. So you can see is that fat, shiny area on the hind tibia there with these long fringes of hair around the edge. And here's the swollen sort of bassi tarsus as well. It's also used to store pollen. So solitary bees comprise the vast majority of bees worldwide. And you can think of solitary bees as hardworking single mothers. So they don't have these social groups in the same way as bumblebees and honeybees do. So every female is effectively their own queen, and they have to do all the egg laying and all the foraging and all the nest building themselves. So it's a tough life for a little solitary bee female. But all female solitary bees are capable of producing offspring. They build and maintain their own nest, and they forage for floral resources as well. And they typically live alone, but some form these communal nests, which is where they share the same nest entrance, but they're not actually social. They don't cooperate in any way, so they all live in individual solitary lives, but they just kind of nest together. And I should mention that solitary bees, the females, unless they're a cuckoo bee, which don't collect pollen, will have the pollen brush on the leg, so it's just a furry leg rather than having that flat, shiny area that the pollen basket that honeybees and bumblebees have. So that's one key character. But the mining bees, of course, our target species includes 2 species of mining bees, so I'll just kind of go through the mining bees. So they're the largest bee genera in Britain, so 61 species. The key identification feature for looking working out if you have a mining bee is to look at the facial fovea. So these are strips of velvety hairs along the inside of the eye margins, which I'll show on a picture on the next slide. And these they're basically connected to secretory glands, and they're believed to play a role in communication in the nest, because essentially they're highly developed in the mining bees and another genus called Panurgus, which tend to be communal nesters, so they nest in sharing the same nest entrance. So they believe that these facial fovea are used then. So when two females come into contact with each other in a nest, they can touch their antennae on these little facial foveas and kind of work out, almost communicate with each other as well. And of course, underground they'll be pitch black, so that's how they communicate. The majority of our mining bees are what we call univoltine, which just means they have one single flight period in the year. So you get spring species that only fly in spring, and then you have summer species that only fly for a certain period in summer, and so forth. And most provision less than one brood cell, so nests for the young per day. So and they believe to produce less than 10 offspring over their entire life cycle. So then they're not particularly efficient at producing the next offspring. So it's a it's a difficult sort of life for them, and they have to kind of make the most of the weather and kind of do what they do before they die. Because most solitary bees don't live much more than about 14 days. And these are the facial fovea. So this is in the species that they're quite obvious because they're very pale, but you can see they're sort of velvety strips along the inner eye margins, and that's what's characteristic really of the mining bee, and is more obvious in this particular species, which is the sandpit mining bee. I've got another picture of it here, but you can see those strips of pale hair. So I like to think of it as eyeliner. So if you see a female bee with eyeliner on, then you're kind of looking at a mining bee. But these strips of velvety hairs can be different colors depending on the species. So when they're brown, it's harder to see, but when they're like pale, very pale like this, then it's quite obvious. So one of our target mining bees is the large scabious mining bee. So this will have those velvety hairs on the inside of the eyes, as with other mining bees. So this is a rare species in the UK. So it's listed as Red Data Book 3. It flies from about late June to about mid-August, possibly a bit later, maybe in early September if you're lucky, but generally sort of around mid-August. And it collects pollen largely from field scabious, but also from small scabious as well. So populations on the Gower, for instance, heavily use small scabious, but then those in Monmouthshire use field scabious, for instance. So, but it's only those two plants that it will use. And in terms of its habitats, it's heavily associated, of course, with scabious habitats, but scabious-rich calcareous grassland. So that really restricts it, I suppose, because we don't get huge amounts of calcareous grassland within Wales. Down in England, you will a bit more, but where we do have is usually coastal. And you can see the distribution, or the known distribution at the moment of it, and it's very much a southern England, South Wales focus. But as with everything, it's could well be overlooked. But there is, I can see, there's a little white circle up for Mid Wales, just north of Aberystwyth. So it was at one point up there, but since been lost. But could well be populations hiding around further north as well. Back and just to note that it's Britain's largest mining bee, so it's quite sizable and substantially larger than the honeybee as well. So if you can get familiar with the size of a honeybee, and you see something a lot bigger on scabious, then you're pretty much guaranteed it doesn't have scabious mining bee. So it's not something that can be easily overlooked. And as with all of the species, and covering the target species are recognizable in the field as well. So as long as you can get a good photo, then if you're a little bit unsure, you can always contact us and we can confirm it, which is quite nice. So the distribution within Wales looks like this. So the white boxes represent where populations haven't been seen since before 1950, so quite a long time ago now. But then the red boxes are where it's been seen since 1990, so it's more recent. So it's very, very South Wales biased, at least with existing populations anyway for this species. But the main areas really are South Pembrokeshire coast, the Castle Martin Range, the Gower. I think only really one site now, because I think one has been lost. So you're looking at sort of the Horton area, if anyone knows sort of Ordainan and Horton around there. And then the around the RAF base in Caerwent is a really important site as well. And then there's the odd little outliers, but I think this one in particular, I think has been lost. So here is the large scabious mining bee, and it comes in two color forms. So you get the red banded form, which is on the left, and then you get this darker form on the right, and then there can be intermediates between the two as well then. And these are all the females, and I'll show you what the male looks like next. But you can, on the right angle, you can see maybe just about make out the quite bright white eyeliner on the female there. which is distinctive of mining bees. So if you keep looking at them, I suppose, a mining bee and get the right angle, especially where the light hits in, you start to see these little facial fovea or these eyeliner, which confirms it's a mining bee. But yeah, the large size alone is enough really to identify it as a large scabious mining bee. But a few other features really are, it tends to be rather hairless, so you can see it almost looks like the hairs have been worn off, but this is kind of as it is. So it's not particularly hairy, particularly on the thorax, on the middle part there. And then you've got that large body size with these red bands, but sometimes they're not red. It's quite a good character. And they also have these bands of white hairs on the abdomen as well. So you can see that, perhaps better on this photo here, on the bottom right there, you can see those bands there. And then it has like this quite golden tail. So it has these sort of like yellowy golden hairs at the tip of the abdomen as well. So there's a few features really you can go for. Rather hairless bee, large body size, may have red bands, but may not. And then these bands of white hairs on the abdomen, and the golden tail. But personally, I think the size alone and looking for the plant that is on is a key character. You will get other bees, of course, using scabious, but generally the host, the food plant, really kind of helps you sway your idea as well. Also, that's probably what I just said. So a large size, the plant that is on, so if it's on field or small scabious, then that's a good indicator. These narrow hair bands on the abdomen, and it's really short and inconspicuous body parts, so very short and obvious hairs on the body as well. The males look very different, I suppose, as is often the case with the bees. So they're slimmer than the females. This is a particularly, I suppose, tatty male. He's been quite old by here, I suppose. But they have these really obvious whitish face. So not the hairs, the actual surface of the face is white. And there's relatively few mining bees that have these yellow faces like that. And then they have these two little small black dots as well on the whitish face, which you can see there. They don't have a pollen brush because no males collect pollen. Only the females are actually collecting the pollen because they've got to take it back to the nest to provide for the young. The males just sort of fly around drinking nectar and spending time with the ladies. So they don't have a bad life, I suppose. So they don't have a dense brush on the legs for collecting pollen. It's very much sparser. But the whitish face is a good indicator, and if you can get a good photo of it, then that helps you work out that is this species. Because a small scabious mining bee also has a white face, as do one or two other species. But the shape of it is quite a good indicator. But the large scabious mining bee males are much larger than any of the other bees with these whitish faces. So as I've got in the text here, they're separated from males of the small scabious mining bee by its larger size, darker wings. So hopefully you can see that the wings are a bit like smoky sort of color. They're slightly darker, and then they would be much clearer in the small scabious mining bee. So that's quite a good indicator as well. And the shape of those facial markings as well. So you can get a clear shot of the face. That could be a good indicator. The small scabious mining bee is much more widespread than the large scabious mining bee, and is considered nationally scarce. So it's not quite as rare as the previous species, but it has undergone a decline, unfortunately, since it was designated as nationally scarce, or whether it will be upgraded to a more threatened category. I don't know, but you can see on the UK map is found right the way up to Scotland. So there's opportunity really to find this almost anywhere within the UK. So it's your best bet if you're not based in South Wales or south of England, then this might be the better species for you to look for, and more chance of finding it. The black dots, I should say, represent where species have been recorded fairly recently, and then I think the grey ones are something like last recorded in the 1980s, and then the white is something like 1950s or something. So you're only really looking at the black dots to represent where populations are known at the moment, but you can see where they've been lost, particularly within southern England, but there's a few white dots, losses from Wales as well. So I can see one up in North Wales as well, but it's one of these things that how often do people really look for these? So somebody might go out and revisit that site or nearby, and it might be hanging on somewhere. So this species flies at a slightly later time than the previous species, so it's not generally active till about mid-July. So we're in the flight period for this one now, and it's only really started a couple of weeks ago. And they fly right the way through to late September. And there's different populations as well. So on calcareous soils, which you get more on the coast, it forages on small or field scabious, so very much the same plants as the large scabious mining bee. And then those populations peak in late July and early August, so around now. But those are more acidic soils, so much more inland, upland sites. Then they use devil's bit scabious, which is the food plant of the marsh fritillary butterfly, which some of you will be familiar with. And hopefully we got some people here today that look for the marsh fritillary butterfly and do larva web count. So it'd be really handy if you can, when you're out in devil's bit scabious habitats, to keep an eye out for this bee. And as devil's bit scabious flowers later in the year, then these populations don't peak then until sort of late August and early September. So I know certainly around by me the devil's bit scabious haven't really started properly yet, but it'll build now as the weeks go on. So as it has these two distinct populations, one that uses calcareous soils and one that uses acidic soils, and uses all three of these different scabious plants, you can find them basically in any sort of scabious-rich habitats, really. So it's always one to keep in mind wherever you see scabious, because it's kind of like a universal bee, I suppose, really. So that's that. And this is the Welsh distribution that we know of at the moment. So it's very patchy. But you can see that there are some known populations just around sort of Macanthus sort of area, and there could well be additional populations in the north, a few lost populations in mid Wales, but then you can see there's mostly South Wales, again the same sort of areas that the large scabious is known from, so those coastal grasslands, because of course you can get devil's bit scabious and field scabious and small scabious all on the coast. So you're looking at the sort of Castle Martin Range again in Pembrokeshire, as well as the Gower, and then there's or have previously been populations on the Vale of Glamorgan coast as well, but these haven't been seen for a number of years now, so they might have been lost as well. And then a population at the heads of the valleys, so in Rhondda and Taff around Hirwaun as well. But there's so much sort of devil's bit scabious habitats around that they could well be, particularly in Carmarthenshire, there's quite a lot of that habitat, so they could be there and they could be elsewhere in the valleys and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's definitely scope for finding this anywhere within Wales and within England if we're in the right habitat. So the small scabious mining bee comes in these two colour forms, the same as the large scabious does. So you have this red banded form, and then you have this black banded form, and then all the intermediates in between as well. So it's very distinctive when you've got the red banded form, like on the left there. So it's got those pale facial fovea, those eyeliner again, which identifies it as a mining bee and kind of rules out anything else. And then it has the first segment of the abdomen is usually black, but then the rest of it then is all red in that form. But then the black banded form, of course, there's usually little bits of red. You can see it right on the ends of each of the abdominal segments, but it can vary quite widely. And this is significantly smaller than the large scabious mining bee. So it's probably more easy to confuse with a lot of other species. So it's more of your typical mining bee sort of size. But it has a few distinctive characteristics. Medium size is probably not much help if you don't know what a medium size is. But you're looking at those forage plants again. So if you're looking at field scabious, small scabious, or devil's bit scabious, and you're seeing these that look similar to this, and that's a good indicator. But Um, in contrast to the large scabious mining bee, the small scabious one has weaker hair bands, so they're not very obvious at all, really, the hair bands on the abdomen. Then they have this much more obvious brown hairs, particularly on the thorax. You can see that in that image there in the top right. You can see it's much furrier than the large scabious mining bee. So that can be quite a nice indicator as well. And the pollen brush itself is dark haired, so it's difficult to see when they've got pollen on their brush there on the hind legs, which is really difficult when it comes to bee identification, because hair color of the pollen brush is quite a well-used characteristic, and it'd be really tricky when they're so full of pollen. But you can see in this image here, you might just be able to make it out, but this is a female that hasn't got pollen on her pollen brush and is very dark haired on the top, at least. So that's another useful characteristic as well. And it's the sort of thing that with practice it becomes quite distinctive, but you might feel a little bit overwhelmed as to identifying these. But it's the thing that practice makes perfect, I suppose. But again, if you can get any clear images, then it's one that we can confirm through an image. So we can always help with identification if you're a little bit unsure if you've seen a small scabious mining bee or something else. The males, again, look different to the females. They don't have the red on them, so they're always dark like this. And then they're a lot slimmer. The males are generally always slimmer than the females in solitary bees. They won't have that pollen brush again, so they won't have the dense hairs on the legs to collect pollen, because the male don't collect pollen. They also have the white face. It's a little bit obscured here by the antennae, but it's also got that similar white face as you get in the large scabious mining bee, with these two little small black spots. And again, the shape of that is a useful characteristic as well. So we can get an image of the face, really, then you know you're okay, really. And we can get that confirmed. So they're separated from the large scabious mining bee by a smaller size. They have clear wings, so you might remember that I said that the large scabious males have these smoky sort of wings, and you can see it's clear on the wings of this male here, and the shape of that face as well. So I'd say always recommend getting a photo. If you think you've got a male, try to get a photo of his face, and then you can be sure then if you're looking at the large scabious, small scabious, or some other sort of bee. So side by side, you can see the size difference. So the large scabious mining bee on the left is significantly larger than the small scabious mining bee. So hopefully it'll be quite obvious if you've seen the large scabious mining bee. But the small scabious one is a little bit trickier because it's much more typical mining bee size. But you can see here some of those characteristics that I mentioned earlier. So you can see the pale facial fovea, the eyeliner in that female there, those little pale bands, which is the key characteristic of mining bees. Then you've got the red banded abdomen, which can or cannot be present, but when it is, it's quite an obvious characteristic. You've got those fairly strong bands on the abdomen of the large scabious mining bee with that golden tail. They also have these sort of very pale-haired pollen brushes as well. So it's pale-haired in the large scabious and dark in the small scabious. So there's a few of the characteristics there. And of course, you can see that the large scabious mining bee is relatively hairless on the body, whereas on the small scabious is much hairier, particularly on the thorax, on that middle part there. So as with everything, there's always lookalikes, and nothing's ever straightforward in the world of entomology. But there are a few other bees that can have red bands that could confuse you. There's the red girdle mining bee on the left there, which being a mining bee will also have those eyeliners. But this has these really sharply defined black tips, so it's similar to the red banded forms of both species. So we'll have this first segment will be quite dark, and then it'll have this red band. But whereas on our scabious bees, it'll be red all the way to the bottom or to the tip of the abdomen. In this particular species, you have this red band, and then it goes back to black. But I wouldn't say it's much of a confusion really, because the flight period of this ends in late June, so it almost falls outside the main flight period for our scabious bees, so they shouldn't really be in the same habitat. And this is a species that doesn't visit scabious. It might just by chance be there just for nectar, but it shouldn't really be visiting scabious flowers. And then another species is the Perkins mining bee, which is quite a rare species, but South Wales is particularly well for it. And this has a red banded form as well as a black banded form. This one might be a little bit more similar and could be present in the same sort of habitats. But this one has dark-haired pollen brush. It's difficult to see here. So I have dark-haired pollen brush above, a bit like Small Scabious Mining Bee. But the key characteristic really for this is that the summer generation, which is the one, obviously summer is when our scabious bees are flying, it forages only on umbella flowers. So like it is here on, I suppose, I can't remember, wild parsnip I think is on there. So as long as this, if you're looking at scabious flowers, this one shouldn't be on scabious flowers. So I think that helps to rule it out. So the actual food plant is on is quite a key identification feature with them. And one that you will see quite a lot in scabious-rich habitats, particularly in devil's bit scabious-rich habitats, is these furrow bees. So this is the common furrow bee, Lacewulus calceatum, and you can see superficially they look quite similar. So you've got a small scabious mining bee on the left there, and then the common furrow bee on the right. And it was only by chance that I put these images next to each other, and I kind of thought that they looked surprisingly similar, particularly to someone that isn't, a beginner in bees. I think it would be quite tricky. But the key things again would be the eyeliner would be present. Only just make it out here, but on a better image, you'll be able to see it. But the eyeliner here would tell you that you've got a mining bee, these are not present in these furrow bees, or really any other bee group within the UK. So it has a slightly different shape as well. The head is a slightly different shape, which would come a little bit more with practice, I suppose. But then another key thing is that these furrow bees tend to have these white sort of scales. So they're like flattened like hairs that are stuck to the body surface. And these are present at the bottom of each of these abdominal segments, which is why this group is commonly called the base banded furrow bees. So the white scales are at the base of each of these abdominal segments. So if you see these like flattened white sort of scales, these won't be present in these mining bees, in particular our scabious bees anyway. But it's one of those things that is hard to get your head around when you're first starting out. But I'm more than happy to help if anyone wants to take images when they're out and about and a bit unsure as to what they're looking at, and do some tutoring via email or other things as well. The main thing when it comes to these furrow bees is they have a furrow basically at the end of the abdomen. So this again will be a female only characteristic, as will the eyeliner on the female mining bees. So on these female furrow bees, they got this rima, we call it, or furrow at the end of their abdomen. And the best way to think about this furrow really is as a bum crack. So if you can see a bum crack on your little bee, then you know you're looking at some sort of furrow bee. So then that instantly rules out our scabious associated mining bees then. But it can be a little bit difficult to see, especially if you've got a very small furrow bee. But it's one of those things, practice makes perfect, and you have to just get a really good view. Another thing that might confuse you is you'll get the furrow bees, the males of them can be very red banded. So you more than likely will see these, particularly on devil's bit scabious in the coming weeks. But the key thing is the males tend to have much longer antennae. So the antennae of these are noticeably longer, or at least once you get familiar with bee identification, you get your eye in for spotting longer antennae in the males. But they won't have that pollen brush that the females will have, because males don't collect pollen. And they also have quite a lot of yellow on the legs. So they have, you can see yellow feet on that one, and little bits of yellow on the tibia there, So the yellow legs is a key character because you won't get any sort of yellow legs on our scabious mining bees. So just touching on our nomad bees, so our two other target species are nomad bees. So there's 36 species of nomad bee within the UK. And these are relatively hairless bees, and they have these bold wasp-like markings. So you might have previously seen these and mistaken them for wasps, but these are actually bees. And these are brood parasites, so they sneak into the nests of things like particularly mining bees, but they do target a few other different groups of bees as well. But generally, they target mining bees. And mining bees are generally most abundant in the spring, so you tend to find most of the nomad bees in the spring. So you might have well seen these in your garden back in sort of April time. So the females have this really quite amazing ability. So they're able to detect nests that are still being provisioned with pollen. So they know they're able to identify nests where the female is still packing it with pollen. And when the female's out of the nest, then going out to collect her pollen to provide for her young, then these nomad bees will sneak into the nest and lay their eggs and then sneak back out with the little mining bee and knowing to what's actually been put in a nest. And the cuckoo bees then, their larvae will hatch from their eggs before that of their host bee and end up eating the food resources then and end up killing the host bee larvae as well. So not good news for the actual mining bees that they target, but of course everything has a role to play, and they're really important little bees, and they give really good indicators as well of where species are nesting. So when you find nomad bees, then you kind of know that you're in the right area really for finding the nests really of their hosts. As I mentioned, spring is a really good time for seeing them, but there are summer species as well, and our nomad bees that we're targeting are of course summer species. So the first of the species that I'm going to touch on is the silver-sided nomad bee. This is Nomada argentata. So this is the cuckoo bee associated with the small scabious mining bee. So this is one to keep an eye out for when you're in, well, any scabious-rich habitat, I suppose. And this is provisionally considered rare. You can see the distribution of it within the UK. It doesn't actually show the one wasp population that we know, but I can show that next. But a very much sort of southern England, just coming into South Wales distribution. But as with anything, it's always worth keeping an eye out for these things because things do crop up in unusual situations sometimes. And the flight period extends from about mid-July to mid-September, so it has a long flight period that matches that of the small scabious mining bee as hosts. And that's because it has these populations and associated with the two different populations of the small scabious mining bee. So this is the Welsh distribution, so not very exciting one because it is only known for one single site within Wales, and that's in Hirwaun, in Rhondda and Taff, at the heads of the valleys. But again, if it's there, why won't it be elsewhere really? And that population is associated with devil-bit scabious ants, but I got a feeling it's got to be elsewhere as well. And it haven't actually been seen at that site since 2004 now, but we're hoping to get out on that site in the coming weeks, and hopefully it's still around and we can find new populations as well. But yeah, it could be anywhere within South Wales or Mid Wales, potentially North Wales as well. So the key characteristics of this, so the females are probably the easiest to ID, but so I'll start with them first. And identifying whether you've got a male or a female in these nomad bees is much trickier because the female nomad bees, as they're cuckoos, they don't collect pollen. They don't have to make their own nests because they sneak into the nest of other bees. So they don't have that pollen brush on the hind tibia that you get in things like mining bees. So that makes it a little bit trickier. So it can take a little bit more practice in identifying the males, but they'll have longer antennae and they can have some other characteristics as well. But starting with the female is a small bee. is will be a sort of similar sort of size to the small scabious mining bee as host, but it's a dark bee. It'll have no yellow or whitish spots on the abdomen, so you can get other bees that are quite dark and have red on the abdomen, and I've got an image of them later, but they always have these, or generally always have these yellow or whitish spots, so this one doesn't have those. It has this quite dark abdomen, but with this sort of red band then through the middle, which is here. So a similar sort of pattern you could say to the small scabious mining bee, or the red banded form of that. The real key thing to look for is it has these dense patches of silver hairs on the side, so hopefully you can make that out in the image there. So there's these like flattened silvery hairs that are stuck to the sides of the abdomen, and that's what gives it its common name, which is silver-sided. I've got arms written there, but it's supposed to be silver-sided. Might be. So apologies on the typo there. And the males essentially resemble the females. They're generally the same, but they're slimmer and they're a lot darker as well. So they don't tend to have that red band that the females have. And the males are quite unusual in having unusually short antennae for a nomad bee. So it's really quite odd, really, in that sense. So they can resemble females, but they'll also have those silvery hairs to the side of the abdomen. So as long as you can get a clear view of the abdomen and you see a dark-looking wasp on scabious, then that's a really good indicator as well. And again, if you can get some clear images, at least we can help you confirm that is definitely the species we're looking for. Here is the armed nomad bee. This is the other species. So this is a species that's considered endangered. So it's really, critically restricted in its distribution. And you can see the current known populations in the black. See very much like a southern England bias, really. But you can probably just about make out there's a few white dots. So there's one down in Cornwall and a few down elsewhere in England, and there's one there in Wales, which is around Swansea. So that's the only known location for this species in Wales ever, and it hasn't been seen there since 1854. Long time now, and I'd really love to rediscover this species. Is hanging on somewhere within, at least in South. And it has a similar flight period to the large scabious mining bee, which is its host, which is late June to early August. So there's not particularly long left, really, to find this. It's a few weeks. And you'll find that in the same habitats as well as its host. So you're looking at scabious-rich calcareous grassland, which is more of a restricted habitat in Wales than it is elsewhere. So the identification of this then, so we have, there's a few things. So it's got a red abdomen, which narrows it down in the amount of nomad bees that have these red abdomens. It has these yellow spots, which is another useful characteristic, and these are at the side of the side of the abdomen. And these are a bit larger than some of the yellow spots you get on some confusion species. A key thing is that it's got these silvery hairs that are on the side of the thorax, or side of the middle there, and at the back of the abdomen, back of the thorax, sorry, there, what we call the propodium. So you can see they're very dense silvery hairs there. And then a few other key things. You have these red spots there, which is on what we call the scutellum. So red spots there. These red spots aren't present in the males, so that can be useful for identifying your females of the species. But the main thing I'd say really to look for is the antennae, because in the females they're banded, so you can see they're red at the bottom, then they have this black band going through them. And then the top segment, the very tip of the antennae, is quite pale. And there's only one other species of nomad bee that has banded antennae like this, and is a lot smaller. And I've got a picture of it next, I believe. Yeah, so there's the other species that would have banded antennae like that. You can see the banded antennae there is Fabricius's nomad bee. which is a very common species, and you get this in gardens and elsewhere. And it's a very small bee, whereas the armed nomad bee would be a large bee, because it'd be sort of a roughly similar size to the large scabious mining bee. But yeah, this is a lot smaller. It does have silvery hairs on the sides of the thorax and at the back of the thorax, but these are not dense. They're much thinner, so you can kind of see through them, if that makes sense. They will have the yellow spots as well on the abdomens, but these tend to be smaller. Sometimes they can be absent altogether as well in this species, or sometimes this one can be absent, but they'll have that one. So that can be a useful thing as well. And then they have these little black bands at the bottom of each segment as well, which is not present in the armed nomad bee. So there's a couple of key characteristics that if you see something that looks like this, then for helping you to separate the two. But this shouldn't be really present in scabious-rich habitats. It could be, but it shouldn't be generally. So you shouldn't really see it, but there's always a chance. So that was a little bit of a whiz through. We're already on 50 minutes, so we've kind of covered quite a lot. So that's the kind of distribution, or at least the known distribution. We have to take a little bit with a pinch of salt, because how often do people really go looking for these? And there could well be other populations hidden away elsewhere. But if you happen to live within areas where were known populations, or where there were historically populations, or places that you think you can fill the gap between perhaps South Wales and Mid Wales and North Wales and so forth, then it's always really useful, and we could really do with your help really in looking for these species. So unfortunately, I'm no botanist, and I'm really rubbish with my plants, but hopefully scabious flowers are quite distinctive to most people. They sort of like look like sort of little pom-poms or pin cushions. So then they're usually this lilac-y blue or violet colour. So they should be quite distinctive. The field scabious on the left there is very rather tall plant. Got these large violet blue flowers that resemble those sort of pin cushions that I mentioned. And you tend to find this in well-drained soils. Whereas with the devil's bit scabious, it's also a tall plant, but it has more rounded flowers. These tend to be more bluer than in the field scabious, as hopefully the image sort of shows there. And it prefers much damper areas, so you tend to find it more in what we would call in Wales roast pasture, so very marshy grassland habitat, I suppose. And the small scabious is almost very similar to the field scabious in its sort of look. I can't really tell you the difference between the two, so I'm not no botanist, so I'm not very good, but hopefully if you can recognize what a scabious plant is, then it's always worth keeping in the back of your mind to look for those scabious associated bees. And of course, field scabious might be quite common in gardens and urban areas, so there's always an opportunity to look for those bees even in those environments, just in case there's populations hiding away. And if you want to kind of know where the distribution of these plants are to help you kind of pinpoint where to look for them, the BSBI, the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, they have a website, and if you just type in, I can't remember what I put now, but BSBI maps or something, but you can see the web address there, and they have these wonderful maps, and you can type in whatever plant you want, but you can search for small scabious, field scabious, and delicate scabious, and they'll show you these little distribution maps then, and it can help you kind of identify known locations for those plants. Another useful tool is Andrena. So this is a Welsh only thing, but this is the database for all of the local environmental record centres within Wales. So these are all the biodiversity record centres. So the one for South Wales, or my particular area from Morgan would be Subrec. There are others, but you can go on this Andrena site, and it's free to use, and you can find out what's in your area. So it has this wonderful tool that you can basically put a little dot on the map, and it'll tell you what's been recorded in your area. But the distribution maps are what I tend to use quite a lot. So you can look up, for instance, the distribution of the bees we've looked at, and also the plants as well. And you can zoom in to quite high resolution and sort of see what's been recorded in the area. So if you're looking for known sites for particular plant species, like our scabious plants, then that can be really useful for pinpointing sites to visit as well. In terms of field equipment that you might need, so you might want a net, but of course that's an optional thing. You can pots and tubes and jars. Again, that's an optional thing if you want to put something in the pot and then have a closer look. That's what I tend to do, and there's no harm to them at all. You can pop them into a pot. If you're under a net, you can just put the pot over the flower and hope that the bee stays in there. And then I tend to use tissue, and you can push the tissue up into the pot and use it to keep the bee against the glass, I suppose, keeping it pressed there. And then it's not moving around. You can have a quick look and then let it go then. I'd say a camera is quite an essential toolkit, and I suppose most phones have got cameras now, but particularly if you've got like a proper camera, so you can get more clearer images. But that would be really useful in helping us to confirm if you think you've seen one, or if you think you've seen something else of interest. So you can send us the photos. Again, a hand lens is another optional thing. If you've got a hand lens and you want a magnified view to looking at something like the hair color on the hind legs or something, then that can be good. And it really depends on how good your memory is, but a notebook is quite a useful thing as well, because you can make a note exactly where you was on a particular site, because there's a few details that we need from you that I'll go on to next. And just remember that obviously we can't condone you just going anywhere recording. We have to say that you'll have to seek sort of landowner permission before doing any formal survey. But of course, if you're walking a coastal path and you just not deliberately going out searching, you happen to be following a right of way and see a bee, then that should be fine. But if you're sort of going out specifically to look for these bees, then always worth getting a landowner permission if it's not a site that you own or yourself or something. Things to bear in mind when it comes to looking for solitary bees. They're very fussy little bees, so temperature is one. So solitary bees, as in most bees, are active during the brightest and warmest part of the day. So you won't, the point is to come really, really early in the morning unless it's quite a hot day. But I tend to head out like around 10 o'clock-ish, and then they seem to get better then, and then sort of by 2-ish then I suppose they've done mostly what they have to do. But you will get them later in the day as well, but you're looking for the brightest and warmest parts of the day. Cloud cover is another important thing, because solitary bees are so fussy that they don't generally come out unless the sun is shining. So you tend to only get honeybees and bumblebees active on overcast days. And so that's really to bear in mind. So you're looking for either at least light cloud, I would say, but ideally sort of sunny intervals, or a totally sunny day would be the best. They don't particularly like the wind either, so you've got to look for kind of sheltered spots if you're out on a breezy day, because bees can see it in ultraviolet, and they sort of identify, they can see heat, and they tend to stick to areas that are warmer and not in those exposed sort of breezes. So yeah, so choose warm sunny days if you can, because that's the best chance of seeing those bees. Just a few things that we will sort of need from you really is, of course, we need to know the date that you potentially seen the bee in question, a location. So you could put a dot on the map if you wanted and send that across, and it would work out where it was. But the most ideal thing would be a 6 to 8 figure grid reference. So if you're not commonly recording invertebrates, you might not be familiar with grid reference system, but there's lots of free online websites that you can grab a sort of grid reference. I think there's actually one called Grab a Grid Reference. But if you type grid reference into Google, it'll come up with them. You can just use a little pointer and put it on the map, and it'll tell you what the grid reference is. Record a name is an optional thing. If you don't want your name recorded, then that's fine. You can give it if you can. Then a brief description of where you are, so the sort of habitat you're in. So if you're in marshy grassland or something, or clifftop grassland or meadow or something, and the more specific you are, the better really. And then the sex, if you know if it's a male or a female, is a useful thing, but not essential, but useful. And then the number that you've seen. So if you said seen at least 5 or at least 10 or only seen 1 or something, that's good as well. And then the photograph that I mentioned earlier is fairly vital really, because it allows us to confirm your identification and get that all verified. It can be sent off then to to other organizations and the record center, so it can be used for conservation as well. There are a couple of ID resources. So if you're looking to get into bee identification, the one I really recommend is one on the left, which is Stephen Falk's Field Guide to the Bees of Britain and Ireland, which is about, I think it's about £25. So it's fairly cheap in the world of entomology, where you can get books for several £100. So it's a very good book. It's quite technical in the sense that it's got keys on there, which are based on using a pinned specimen, but there's the actual species profiles, so the information on each of the species, and there's some lovely images, and they're really useful. And there's some fantastic illustrations by Richard Lewington, who's a well-known illustrator. But if you want to get really into bees, then the Handbook of the British Bees is another one as well, by George Else and Mike Edwards, but that relies on specimens only, so it's not as practical if you want to, as an everyday thing and you don't intend to take specimens of bees. And then a few other books. There's Ted Benton's Solitary Bee book, which I've never used. I wouldn't say it's really like as good as Stephen Falk's in terms of identification, but it's good in other things as well, in terms of general information about solitary bees. And then a book that I really love, if you're just interested in the solitary bees, is this one called Solitary Bees, by American authors, who's got some wonderful information about biology and evolution and conservation and all wacky life cycles and stuff. Definitely, if you're getting into bee identification, is look at Stephen Falk's Flickr pages. So if you put in Stephen Falk bees or something, Flickr into Google, it should come up with Stephen Falk's website, and he's got images of all of the UK species of bee. So it's a really useful tool, and he's got images on live as well as pinned and key characteristics, and he's got these information as well on these little drop down where it says show more, and you can tells you basically all the same information that's in his bee book. So that's a really useful tool if you want to look up species in the field or at home and work out what you got and that sort of thing. And the Bees, Wasps and Ants Recording Society have their own website, and they have species profiles as well, with lots of information and images. So if we just put in bee wars into Google, that should come up. That's the website at the bottom there, beewars.com. And then another thing that you might like, Buglife published a Wales threatened bee report back in something like 2018 or 2017. And this covers some of our rarest bees in Wales, and it includes our scabious bees. So there are designated pages for that species, and it'll tell you a bit about its distribution. It's got those maps that I featured earlier, the Wales-specific maps, and talks about habitat management and a few other things as well. So there might be some useful information on our target species you want to look at there. And you can find that on our website. If you just put in Wales threatened bee report into Google, it should come up. And then essentially, if you can just tell us if you get out and look for these bees, even if you're unsuccessful in finding them, it'd be really useful to know where people have been looking, even if it's outside of Wales, because it'd be useful information if we go back to our fund as opposed to a lottery. And then just to say that if you do see any and you send us records, then we'll share those records then with the relevant environmental record centres like SUBREC, for instance, down in South Wales, or wherever for the general areas. So it can be used then when it comes to development and other applications like that. So it can actually conserve species on the ground. The records can go to the Bees, Wasps and Ants Recording Society as well, and any sort of county recorders if there is one, like there is in Pembrokeshire, for instance, and obviously get sent to the landowners, so we can target habitat management on those sites as well and make them aware of